review. Please welcome George R.R. Martin.
Thank you.
Have you always been a writer, George?
Yeah, pretty much. It's set in at an early age, and I did indeed make up stories and sell them to the other kids in the projects for, I started out with a penny, but I rapidly raised my prices all the way to a nickel, which could buy a Milky Way bar. So 2-story sales, and I get a comic book. So, but it ended, that little professional career in my childhood ended abruptly when one of the other kids who was my regular customer started having nightmares about the stories, and his mother came to my mother, and no more. So, damn.
Do you know what inspired those early stories, where they came from even then?
I don't know where any of this stuff comes from. It just it comes, thank God, and I'm glad it does. If I want to get all psychological, I can say maybe I was trying to fill a need in my life for, for adventure, for travel and all that. I mean, we were poor. We lived in the projects. We didn't even own a car. We never went anywhere. I lived in a world that was 5 blocks long from First Street where I lived to Fifth Street where my school was. So I would, read of these other places and dream of other planets and distant lands and darkest Africa and the Far East and the ancient Rome and all of the places that one could read about in books, and making up stories about these places allowed me to go there in my imagination, even if I couldn't go anywhere beyond Fifth Street in reality.
And were there books or shows or comics or those that were inspiring to you then, that maybe influenced you, the direction your stories took?
Well, I always loved the weird stuff, as my father called it. We're talking now the early mid-50s, which there wasn't a lot of science fiction or much less fantasy or horror around, so I seized eagerly on the shows that were, like the original Twilight Zone with Rod Serling, but even before that, the science fiction shows of the early 50s, things like Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, and Captain Video, which I barely remember. I was very young when Captain Video was on, and a little later, Rocky Jones, Space Ranger, which had a huge impact on me. A very cool show. Sort of the precursor to Star Trek, if you actually kind of look at it. Of course, science fiction and horror movies. The science fiction movies of the 50s were all about atomic bomb growing grasshoppers to the size of 747s, which was, pretty cheesy, but they were cool in their own way.
And when did you realize that writing could be, beyond that sort of early penny and nickel sales? When did you realize that writing could actually be a profession, a career you'd want to pursue?
Oh, about 3 years ago. No, in my early childhood, I was confusing the reality for the imagination. I decided I actually wanted to be a spaceman, which is what we called it before the word astronaut was coined. And nobody had ever heard the word astronaut until the Mercury program, when they didn't want to use the word spaceman. But before the Mercury program, in the days of Rocky Jones and all that, it was guys who went into space were spacemen. And, you could choose among the kids in my neighborhood. There were the ones who wanted to be cowboys and the ones who wanted to be cops and, the ones who wanted to be spacemen. And I was on the spaceman side and later upgraded to an astronaut. But at some point I decided, no, I'm never going to do this. So how about I just make up stories about outer space instead of actually going to outer space? And that was fine until I think it was like junior year of high school. They gave us an assignment to research the profession that we proposed to enter. So I researched fiction writer and discovered that the average fiction writer made $1,200 a year from their fiction. And even in, 1965, $1,200 a year was not a hell of a lot of money. So, and when some of my relatives heard that, they said, maybe you should be like an electrician. They make good money. Plumbing. Have you considered plumbing? People always need a plumber, and then you can make up these crazy little stories of yours on the side and collect that extra $1,200. So I didn't go into plumbing, but I did follow journalism since I was good with words and good with writing. I went to college. I majored in journalism, and the plan was, well, I would write a few stories on the side and things like that, but my main profession would be as a journalist. But it turned out that I started selling, even when I was still in college, selling my first short stories to the magazines, and then I did a couple years in Vista, alternative service, and continued to sell more stories. And by the time I got out of Vista and finished those 2 years, I had enough stories under my belt, and being, kind of young, and I didn't have a lot of expenses then. I could live very cheap with roommates in a bad neighborhood in Chicago and all that. And I said, well, I don't want to really try to go out and get a real job here. I'll just continue to write this story thing and see where it leads. And it led to some pretty good places for me. So I'm glad I continued that.
And did the studying in the journalism, did that affect your writing in any way, or direct it in any different way?
Well, journalism school certainly affected my writing. I don't know if, since I didn't actually practice journalism, I don't know if it did, but the training for journalism I found was very good in several ways. First of all, it was good for my style. I mean, I wrote those monster stories as a kid. I wrote for comic fanzines when I was in high school, little amateur stories about superheroes that were published in the amateur magazines of the day. But my style at the time was, let us say, purple. I seemed to be operating under the assumption that if one adjective was good, three were better. So I would just pile on the adjectives, and I mistook that kind of verbose prose for rich and textured and poetic prose. And journalism school cured me of that, as the professors kept drawing lines through all of my wonderful adjectives. And, hardly an adverb survived the entire 4 years. And it was also good for me. I mean, I was, as a younger kid, I was very shy. I was a kid who lived in my imagination, who, as they said, always had my nose in a book. And training as a reporter actually forced me to kind of come out of my little shell a little and go out there and meet people. And I had to approach total strangers and ask them questions and, set up interviews, and some of them with some pretty fearsome, authority figures and people that I would not normally have, dared to talk to in my ordinary life, It made me more outgoing. It sort of opened me up as a shell, which I think was also good for a writer, the ability to talk to different sort of people and so forth and so on.
And how did you get to Hollywood to be a writer for television?
Well, that was, I never actually wanted, I liked watching television, but I never wanted to be a writer for television. It was not part of my dreams. I just wanted to write books. And it all had to do with commercial vagaries of the market. And actually with, there's a lot of truth to the old saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know, especially in Hollywood, where contacts are a huge part of it. I was a science fiction writer in my early career, and I published a number of short stories. I was nominated for awards. I won some awards. 6 or 7 years into it, I wrote my first novel, which was pretty successful. Then I wrote a second novel in collaboration, and that was even more successful. And my third novel was a vampire novel that kind of broke out of the strict genre things, and that was yet even more successful. And I was getting higher and higher advances for all of these. And then I wrote my fourth novel, which was a book called The Armageddon Rag, which was a rock and roll mystery, dark fantasy kind of hybrid novel that my editors said, well, this is going to be it. This is your big breakthrough, the book. We're going to make this book a bestseller. And they paid me a 6-figure advance for it. And came up with this big advertising campaign to make it a bestseller, and it was great. I was looking forward to my, incipient career as a famous best-selling writer. The only problem was the book failed to best sell. In fact, it failed to sell at all. It became like my worst-selling book that I had ever written, and suddenly my career as a novelist was over. Because after that, I couldn't get arrested. I'd been like a hot rising writer for a number of years, and publishing is not unlike Hollywood in that it's not a profession. And I know you guys are film students and into this thing. It's not a profession built for security. If security is important to you, don't go into this profession, because you can be the hottest thing in town on Tuesday, and on Wednesday nobody's going to return your calls. All those dear friends that you think you had that you've been having lunch, and that certainly happened to me. Suddenly, I couldn't sell another novel at any price. I thought, okay, well, the Armageddon Rag failed. I'll have to come down in my price. I won't get a six-figure advance again, but I'll get like a high five-figure advance like I did for Fever Dream. No. I'll get like a low five-figure advance. No. By the end, I was willing to even listen to offers for a four-figure advance, but nobody was offering anything because the book had sold so dismally. Got great reviews. But, oddly enough, this self-same book that destroyed my career in publishing also opened the door to Hollywood for me, because my film agent showed it to another client of his, a guy named Phil DeGuerre. And Phil was a experienced television writer. He'd been on a number of shows as a staff writer and producer, and he'd recently gone on to do his own show, and he had a hit show called Simon and Simon that he had invented, and he was coming up with another show called Whiz Kids, one of the first shows about computer hackers, but what our agent, we had the same agent, Marvin, knew was that Phil was also a dead rock and roll guy, and he was a Deadhead, and he loved to go to Grateful Dead concerts. He knew all the Dead. He had backstage passes and things like that. And he knew the rag would appeal to him, so he showed him Armageddon Rag, and indeed Phil did want to appeal. He wanted to get into feature film, so he optioned Armageddon Rag for a feature film. And he was going to write it himself, write the screenplay himself. He was going to direct it himself. And the first thing he did was fly me out to Los Angeles to talk to me about it. Now, I'd sold other options before. If you have a lot of books and short stories and they get any kind of attention, in those days especially, you'd find someone to option them in Hollywood. The world has changed a lot. We're talking now the early 80s. So it doesn't work quite the same way anymore. But in those days, these cheap options were all over. And I would have 4 or 5 or 6 of my short stories and things under option simultaneously. But normally they option it, they send you a check, You never actually met any of these people or talked to them. They didn't care. You were just the author of the original material. They didn't necessarily want to involve you in the process. But Phil did. And so he flew me out, and we had some meetings, and we discussed how we would do the Armageddon Rag, and a few tricky points about the novels and so forth. And I got to visit TV sets and watch him filming Simon and Simon, and watched him filming the Whiz Kids, which sort of was his Armageddon Rag that sank without a trace after a short time. But he was still hot enough so that I made that contact with Phil, and we remained friendly. So like a year or two passes, and suddenly CBS has said to Phil, well, we want to get another show from you. Simon is doing real well. What else do you got? And Phil says, I want to bring back Twilight Zone. I always loved Twilight Zone. And I said, oh, okay, well, sure, we own Twilight Zone. You can bring it back. So Phil ramped up to do Twilight Zone, and he turned to a lot of science fiction and fantasy prose writers, and called me up and said, hey, you ever think of doing writing for television, doing a Twilight Zone episode? And, since I was in fact, I had run out of money and was wondering how I was going to pay my mortgage and couldn't sell another book because of the failure of Armageddon Rag, I was eager to try this new thing. And I said, sure, I'll do some Twilight Zones. And I wrote a script for him, and led to another script, and et cetera, et cetera. Next thing I knew, I wound myself out as a staff writer, moving to L.A. for 6 weeks or so to work on the on the Twilight Zone staff.
And after that came Beauty and the Beast?
Yeah, there was 2 seasons of Twilight Zone, and a brief flirtation with Max Headroom was in there briefly, and then Beauty and the Beast for 3 years, and then 5 years in development, which sometimes known as development hell. So, all told, I spent about 10 years primarily working in Hollywood.
Well, we're going to take a look at a scene from an episode of Beauty and the Beast. This is an episode called Brothers, where the Beast, Vincent, played by the legendary Ron Perlman, connects with a character called the Dragon Man, who's, as you'll see, also ostracized from society for his appearance, much like a Beast. So let's take a look at Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, that was from the 2nd season of Beauty and the Beast, which is probably, of the 3 seasons we did, the one that's most representative of the show that we actually wanted to do. I enjoyed my 10 years out in Hollywood. I learned a lot from it. It was very valuable to me in a number of ways, not only financially, where it certainly was helpful to me after the situation I'd found myself in after Armageddon Rag, but also, as a writer, I learned things. But there were also frustrations. There's no doubt that working in television and film requires a certain temperament and skills that prose writers, book writers don't necessarily need or often have. And I found that on both Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast, and even later in development. The thing that really, I think, drove me back to prose, there were a number of things, but one of them was the constant arguments with other people, the politics, the fighting of it. It's when I sit down to write Ice and Fire, I can just do the work, and ultimately I am the judge. Yes, I have editors, and my editors make suggestions to me. They say, well, we don't think this thing is working, and I give their words consideration, and I change things if I think they should be changed. But in television and film, of course, you've got all these people, the studio and the network and the standards and practices department and the actors and the directors and the producers. And sometimes it's hard enough to do the good work, and then you do the good work, and then there's other people who want to mess around with it, or they have their own idea and all that. And so you have to have a temperament not only to do the good work, but to fight for your work. And I don't necessarily enjoy fighting. After I mean, I did it, and I defended my work as best I can, and I won some and I lost some. But after a while, some of it just wore me out. That if you know Beauty and the Beast, the show, we always wanted to do shows like this, character-based shows. I think from the very beginning, the network wanted us to be the Hulk. They wanted a much more formulaic show that was much more action-oriented, where Catherine would get in trouble every week, and Vincent would beast out and come to her rescue. And there are more shows that fit that criteria. I think you'll see in the first season, where, and they even said, well, can we... the Hulk, he always beasts out twice. He would beast out, or would Hulk out, as they called it, at the end of the second act, and then he would have a bigger Hulk act in the climax where he would solve the situation. And they really wanted us to do the same thing. Well, we'd like 2 beast out in episodes. And could we have less of the poetry reciting and all that? And, we wanted more of the character pieces and all that. And, of course, you're in a constant struggle depending on your ratings. The stronger your ratings are, the more you can do it the way you want, and the weaker your ratings are, the more help they will give you. And we did pretty well the first season and a half. So by the second season, we were really doing the shows we wanted to do, and was kind of disregarding the network pressures, but they were still there waiting, and we were winning our time slot for the first season, and we weren't like a top 10 show or anything, but we were winning the time slot, which was very good. And then I think NBC. We were on CBS. NBC made a change up in the lineup opposite us, and they had a couple sitcoms on opposite us, and they replaced one of them with a new sitcom called I think it was Full House, and starring the Olsen twins, and this goddamn thing became a hit, and suddenly we were not winning our time slot anymore. And the network was coming more and more down on us of, oh, my God, you're losing your time slot. And, that's why I've always hated the Olsen twins. And still, due to this day.
You've given me another reason to.
That's right.
Were there things that you learned when you were writing, serial television that would inform your books later on?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the structure of Song of Ice and Fire with his viewpoint things and cutting between the viewpoints and all of them ending essentially with, I don't know, cliffhangers or interesting points is a structure I learned in television. You won't see it in my earlier novels, but of course, working for network television, you have to have act breaks. And depending on the structure of the show, is it a four-act show? Is it 4 acts plus a teaser, or 5 acts, or is it a teaser and a tag, what have you. But you always have to go out on an act break before you go to the commercial. And it can be a cliffhanger. That's a good act break. It doesn't have to be. It can be just a twist point or a new revelation or a piece of information or, something is resolved. But, it's if you watch Law and Order, it's always the da-da-da-da moment, where right before the commercial, da-da-da-da, oh, my God, something has changed here. And the idea is to bring you back after the commercial, of course, but it's a good way to end a chapter or an act. And sometimes it's pretty hard when you're designing your story to come up with those act breaks, but, that's why you get the big bucks. And it certainly works in the books, too. It's keeps people reading. They reach the end of the chapter, and they want to know what happens to that character because they're engrossed in Tyrion. But gosh, there's not another Tyrion chapter for a while yet. First, they have to read this Arya chapter or this Jon Snow chapter before they finally get back to Tyrion. And those end. And by the time they finish the Arya chapter, there's kind of an act break there too, and that hopefully draws them back for the next one. So yes. And also, I think it helps your dialogue when working in television and you're actually hearing actors speaking your lines. I look at my earliest scripts and I would have people giving long speeches, that take up a substantial chunk of the page. And it's too much. You get much better readability and especially for contemporary audience if the characters aren't giving speeches to each other but are having much shorter back and forth kind of dialogue.
And it's interesting because I think the in Game of Thrones, that idea of leaving people wanting more is a constant thing. And there's also the idea of, Game of Thrones and the books, Songs of Ice and Fire are not like other books that one might compare them to or other shows. They often break the conventions of the very genre that one might assign them to. How does that play into how you write?
Well, I've always liked breaking conventions. I love the genres. I'm not one of these guys who's trying to burn everything down with a flamethrower. I love science fiction. I love fantasy. But I hate familiarity. I love, whether I'm watching television or going to a film or reading a book, I want it to surprise me. I don't want to know where it was heading, Maybe I get that from my childhood with my mother. We would sit at home watching TV as a family, and my mother would always say aloud exactly what was going to happen. Oh, it's the butler who killed him. And sure enough, it would be the butler who killed him, She would, be watching I Love Lucy, and, oh, that belt is going to start going much faster. She's not going to be able to keep up with the chocolates. And, yeah, sure enough, that would happen. So I learned pretty early the trick of watching these shows and predicting where they were going to go. The one which she couldn't predict, of course, maybe it was one reason I loved it so much, was the original Twilight Zone with the famous twist endings. It's hard for a crowd looking around. I see a lot of young people here in this audience, and to know what a revolutionary show Twilight Zone was in 1959 and 1960, and how surprising those twist endings were. When we revived Twilight Zone in the mid-'80s, the network was always on us. One of the things we had on that show is, why can't you have more twist endings as the original show did? And we tried, man, but what worked in 1959 really did not work in 1986. I tell you, people, the audience had become so much more sophisticated, and they could see those twist endings coming a mile away. It's the minute somebody walks into the store, it's she's a mannequin. Yeah, of course she's a mannequin. The minute you don't show the face of a bandaged character. Oh, they're all the ugly ones. Haven't you noticed that they're not showing their faces? Yeah, these great techniques that Rod Serling invented in 59 in the ensuing 20, 30 years had become so familiar to the audiences you couldn't put it over on them anymore. So coming up with a really genuine twist ending that worked became harder and harder. Someone should tell that to M. Night. He should drop trying for those twist endings.
Well, let's take a look at one of the many, we won't call it a twist, but surprises, perhaps, in Game of Thrones.
Okay.
I mean, not many shows or books have the guts to kill a 10-year-old, let alone after him catching an incestuous relationship.
That's true. Probably even more surprising in a book where, of course, he's the first Viewpoint character. He's the Viewpoint character of the first chapter, and then we switch away to a couple of viewpoints and don't come back to him. But since he was first, I think the assumption of most readers is that he's going to be, the main guy through that, and then suddenly you think he's dead, or maybe he's dead. But we find out more later. But it's what we write what we want to read, and as I said a minute ago, I don't like stories or books that are too familiar, that are too predictable, that I feel like I've read 1,000 times before. So I want to keep you on edge and surprise you and make you think that no one is safe. And that was certainly the intent there. And that scene has, I think, gotten a lot of people hooked on these books and said, I thought I was reading just another fantasy till I hit that scene, and then I realized that this was something a little different. So that moment has worked very well for me.
It's an interesting point because, in the 60-odd years since the Twilight Zone, these sorts of stories have really gained an enormous foothold in popular culture. You look everywhere from the literary world to movies to television to video games to everything. It's, fantasy stories, superheroes, these sorts of stories that are so dominant. Why do you think we've seen such a dramatic shift in terms of acceptance and popularity?
Because we geeks have conquered the world.
Yes.
Actually, doing an interview yesterday, I one of the reporters interviewed me, said his TV station specializes in geek and nerd culture, and it really took me back to my own high school days, where geek and nerd were not things that you wanted to be called, and now they've become, proud badges of a group that has a culture. So the world really has changed. My father called all this stuff weird stuff. He couldn't understand why I had this interest in weird stuff, science fiction, fantasy, horror, because it wasn't like real. He liked Westerns, which, of course, as we know, were very real. All those gunfighters meeting in the center of the street to practice their quick draws. Yeah, that happened every day. I don't know, but it's nice to be part of the culture that has conquered the world and taken over popular entertainment. I think there's these are all flavors of imaginative literature, to put it in of the romantic tradition is another way to put it, as opposed to realism, which in a great literary tradition I think split off at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and into two currents, one of which was considered more respectable than the other. The realistic tradition became the literary tradition, and all the genre fiction which followed the romantic tradition sort of got shuffled off into ghettos. But it still appeals much more to a much larger audience. And science fiction and fantasy, especially as the world has shrunk around us, and with the television news and our technology, there's no longer, lost cities in Africa or the exotic Far East or all of these colorful places where old adventure stories used to take place. These corners of the world all now have, Starbucks in them. And so we go to outer space, and we go to realms of the Hyborian Age or Middle Earth or other alternate worlds to find the kind of color and the verve that we used to get out of romantic, the tradition of romanticism and adventure stories and things that people like Robert Louis Stevenson wrote.
And yet, even in your stories, these imaginative stories, there's a grittiness, there's a realism to the characters and the situations.
Well, I think the characters have to be real. Characters, to my mind, are the heart of all fiction, and characters fascinate me. Human beings fascinate me, and always have. We're such wonderfully perverse and contradictory, creatures. My quarrel with a lot of fantasy as it was written, particularly by the Tolkien imitators, not Tolkien himself, but the writers who followed him into high fantasy in the 70s and early 80s, was that they presented a very simplistic view of human nature, and the war between good and evil as a subject for fantasy, I think, is legitimate for the subject for any fiction. But to my mind, the war between good and evil is not fought between armies of heroes in white cloaks and armies of really ugly guys in black cloaks, but rather is fought within the individual human heart in the choices that we make in times of crisis. I think all human beings have within them the capacity for good and the capacity for evil. And in fact, we're all, I look at history, and all of the greatest heroes have flaws. All of the greatest villains have moments of humanity or redeeming qualities about them. And to my mind, that doesn't make them less interesting. That makes them more interesting. I was talking last night. I don't know how much I'm duplicating myself here, how much of you were at last night's thing as well, but one of the great things about working for HBO is they have shown, not only on my show, but on a variety of their other shows beforehand, shows like The Sopranos and Boardwalk Empire and other shows, that they're willing to present as the central characters of their shows very flawed and human characters who are full of contradictions. I mean, a character like Tony Soprano, who is at one point a family man who obviously deeply loves his children, and he loves his wife, which doesn't prevent him from fucking around with all sorts of other random women that he encounters. And you'll see him feeding the ducks at his backyard pool and being very upset that the ducks have flown away. And then a couple acts later, he sees a guy who owes him money, and he runs him over with the car and gets out and starts kicking him in the head. And yet, do you like Tony Soprano? I don't know if you like Tony Soprano or not, but you certainly find him fascinating. And I think you do find him sympathetic on some level. His humanity makes you kind of want to root for him. But then he starts kicking someone in the head, and you sort of have to examine, whoa, why am I rooting for him? What am I doing there? And, that sort of reaction to me is very healthy. And the frustration about working for traditional network television is that for most of their history, certainly the period I was working for them, they were not interested in presenting anyone that was flawed or unlikable. And they were trying to pre-test everything with their focus groups and all that. I mean, one incident from my own career, after Beauty and the Beast, I did development, and I wrote a number of pilots for them, only one of which was filmed, which was an alternate world show called Doorways. And in the opening sequence of Doorways, it's a parallel world show. This sort of feral girl from an alternate dimension appears suddenly in the middle of a freeway on Earth, at night. And there's all that. She's never been on a freeway. She's never seen cars or trucks before. And there are all these vehicles rushing at her at high rates of speed, And she has this alien weapon with her, this gun that shoots explosive needles. And the cars are all honking and all that, and they're slamming into each other as they try to avoid this person on foot who suddenly appeared in the middle of the freeway. And then she sees this huge tanker truck coming toward her, and it can't possibly get out of the way. It starts to brake, and it starts to jackknife, and it's obviously going to hit her and kill her. So she whips out the alien weapon and blows the shit out of it. And it's a spectacular sequence, and it was in the script, and it got proved all the way through. And it's the opening scene of the thing, and done right, it should have been very effective here. And we're reaching the screening stage, and suddenly the network realizes something, and they say, wait a minute, what happened to the driver of the tanker truck? Well, she blew the shit out of him. He's dead. Oh no, we can't have that. He's just an innocent teamster. He's just driving his truck, and suddenly there's this girl, and he brakes. He tries to avoid her. He doesn't deserve to die. I said, well, no, but, she doesn't know any of that. She just sees this big iron thing heading toward her, and she has this weapon that'll stop it from killing her, so she uses it. It's like a monster to her. Well, yes, but if she kills this teamster, this truck driver, the audience will hate her. No one will watch the show. They'll turn it off right there. Oh, I'm not going to watch a show about a murderer. But we never even see this guy. We don't see a driver. We see a truck coming at us, and she blows it up. I'm saying the audience is not going to care. They're not even going to realize that there's a guy in the truck. No one is going to make this intellectual thing. But no, the network was locked in on that. So we had to go back and boot up the cameras again and shoot a scene where the driver, unharmed, leaps from the flaming truck and goes running away, scampering to safety. So we know, even though his truck is lying in pieces all over the sidewalk, that no harm has come to innocent Joe, the truck driver, who has gone home to his wives and children. So the focus group would like my character and not dislike her because she blew up the truck. So, so that's the difference between working for HBO and working for a network.
Well, let's take a look at another that I suspect a focus group would also disapprove of. I'm just going to guess that the old knife through the eye is not a popular focus group moment.
I don't know if the focus groups would like that very much. That brings me, I don't want to slag on Beauty and the Beast. I learned a lot on that show, and I think we did some very good work, but we did have our troubles with the network on that one, which, again, is indicative of what's going on. Beauty and the Beast, how many of you ever watched Beauty and the Beast? Okay, a good number there. It was a very romantic show. And we were nominated for Emmys. We were a very well-regarded show, and we had pretty decent ratings. Never hit ratings. We were watched like 97% of our audience was women, however, which I thought was fine. But the network wanted some men to watch the show, and they were always on us to increase the action because they thought if we had more action, then that would get more men to watch. aggression is the network word for violence. They can't actually ever say violence because then someone might find it on a memo and they would be accused of trying to put more violence on TV. And they have the standards and practices group that always reviews your scripts that is telling you, oh no, this is too violent. It will be too disturbing to the audience at home. Please remove it. Please tone it down or something like that. And from the very first time I started work, even on Twilight Zone, where we had some of the same problems, but certainly on Beauty and the Beast, I bristled at the hypocrisy of this. Because it seems to me that if you're going to present violence, and then there's an obligation to present violence honestly, and to present it as things like this, as the knife through the eye. I mean, Vincent was killing people. He was ripping people apart with his claws, is what he was doing in the action scenes where he rescues Catherine. But we were never allowed to show any blood. At one point we thought, there was the classic Beauty and the Beast that Cocteau did, La Belle and La Bête, where the Beast, when he came back from hunting, his hands would smoke. And that was, of course, a symbolic way of showing, an artistic way of showing blood. And we kept trying to come up with what's our thing. Well, we can't use smoke. Cocteau's already used the smoke. People will say we're just ripping him off, so we can't do that. But we can't show actual blood either. So, and the network didn't even like the fact that he was killing people. They said, well, the Hulk never killed people. Couldn't he just destabilize them? And like what? Well, he should pick them up and throw them a long distance, and they could bounce off the wall, and then we could see them get up and say, "Feats don't fail me now," and run away in terror. And I said, then wouldn't the city be full of thugs who have been thrown across the room by a lion man? So, no, we finally got them to allow that he would rip them apart and they would go down and they would not get up. But we still were never allowed to show any blood, which means that, although in an intellectual sense, if you watch the episodes, you know that he's killing people, but you never really feel it in a visceral sense. And it is necessary to feel it in a visceral sense. And, we would do episodes where he kills almost no one, or where it's all character-based. An episode like Brothers that you saw earlier, that's a great deal of it is psychological. And they wouldn't like that. They wanted more action episodes, get more action in it. We got to get some men watching this show. It's all just women watching this show. It's, how are we going to balance our demographics here? They're wildly unskewed. And we never succeeded in that, but we became, unbeknownst to anyone, we became the most violent show on television. There was a period there where the show Hunter, which was on the same time as us, was really getting criticized because it was so violent. Hunter was, shooting people with every episode, and they were dying. And we actually said, we're 3 times as violent as Hunter. Vincent is killing way more people than Hunter. Hunter is killing barely one guy an episode. Vincent is going in there with 3 or 4 thugs and ripping them to shreds and leaving their entrails in pools on the floor. But of course, we're not allowed to show any of that, And then after he does that, he reads a poem. So... So the lesson is that if you're going to have a lot of real violent stuff, have your character read a poem afterwards, and it just cancels it all out. Of course, you'll never get any men to watch it then because, oh my God, he's reading a love poem. Quick, turn to Hunter. I might have to hear more of this stuff. But, of course, thankfully on HBO we don't have any, we can present that. But that scene is an interesting scene because they, in the book, those of you who read the books know that it is a somewhat different scene in the book. In the book, all of the characters are on horseback. He is riding back with Jory on their horses from the brothel, and he is accosted by Jaime and his men who are also on horses. Also, it is at night. And it is during a rainstorm, so the rain is pouring down all around us. And that is exactly the way that David and Dan wrote it when they did the first draft of the script, at night, in the rain, on horses. And, of course, as filming time approached and budget overruns happened one by one, each of these elements got lost. Oh, okay, well, it doesn't have to be during the rain, does it? We'll lose that. Do we really need it to be night? It would be fit the schedule better if it was day, and horses, do we have to have horses? So we wound up, instead of at night in the rain on horses, we wound up on foot in the day, nice and dry. Would have been great to do it the way it was originally written, very atmospheric and cool in the rain and the horses, but this way they certainly got it a lot quicker, and it still worked. And I think the realities of television production means you do have to sometimes make these changes to fit your budget and your shooting schedule. The trick is to know where to draw the line and what to fight for. What is something where you can change the fundamentals of a scene without harming the scene, and other changes that rip a scene to shreds because you're accidentally ripping out the heart of it, or maybe deliberately ripping out the heart of it as you make a change to make it more shootable.
Because the show really is very faithful to the books.
Yes.
If not exactly...
Quite faithful.
Yeah, if not exactly a representation of them. The major change, of course, is really around perspective, because the books do change perspective, and the show does not as much.
But it's all through... Well, I mean, as a novelist, you have certain tools at your disposal to tell a story with. And these tools are not available to a filmmaker. I mean, as a novelist, you are, you have internal monologue. You can do exposition simply as part of the narrative. You have access to the character's thoughts. You can do unreliable narrators, where you really can't do any of this as a filmmaker or a television director. You're external. You're never inside the character. I mean, yeah, you could try to be. There are those occasional experimental films where you're looking out through someone's eyes and there's a voiceover telling you their thoughts. They're mostly terrible and don't work very well. The voiceover in film is usually a technique that says something really isn't working here, and we're having to patch it over with this clumsy voiceover technique, and is frequently added at a later point, like the famous voiceovers in Blade Runner, which I think really detract from that film and weren't necessary. But you have other techniques that make up for that as a filmmaker or television writer. You have tricks that are not available to novelists. You can bring in music to heighten suspense or to build up the emotional impact of the scene. You can do things with lighting, and of course your actors can bring a tremendous amount to it with just a look, just the expression on their faces. I mean, the scene we showed last night, I referred to in the comments afterwards, where King Robert is arriving in Winterfell, and he hops off his horse and walks up to Ned and, looks at Ned and says, "You've got fat." And Sean Bean just sort of raises his eyes and looks him up and down, and the whole audience howls with laughter because, of course, it's Robert who's really gotten fat. That was something that the two of them did. I doubt it was even in the script. I bet it was, I don't know, some byplay of the actors, but maybe it was in the script. But I certainly could not have done that in prose. I mean, imagine trying to write that in prose, and how would it go? Ned, "You've got fat," Robert said. Ned flicked his eyebrows. Ned raised his head up and down. It doesn't have the same impact as actually seeing Sean Bean's face as he does that little trick. So you have to always be aware of what medium you're working in, and what things will work in it and what things don't work in it.
Now, as a fan, I have to get to season 2 just quickly. We're going to take a look at a scene here, I think, from season 2, and then I'll ask you a bit afterwards. Sure. Now, as a fan, I know there's a whole heaping of awesomeness that occurs in book 2. How, just How excited should I be, George? I don't know if I can get more excited. What set us up for season 2? What should we expect?
Well, of course, I haven't actually seen season 2 either, so I'm also pretty excited. I was able to visit the set during the filming of the original pilot, and then when we got season 1, I was able to visit a couple of the sets for a couple of weeks. But last year when they were filming season 2, I was just too busy. Dance with Dragons had just come out, and I was on like a 12-city book tour and having to attend some major conventions, and then I had to go home and do some work, so I wasn't able to actually see them shoot any of this. So I'm seeing some of these trailers and such for the first time. I know I'm pretty excited about my own episode, which, again, I haven't seen, but I know it was in the script, and it's episode 9, which is the Battle of the Blackwater, probably the biggest battle in the books. And it's a massive set piece, and we hired Neil Marshall to direct it. First time he's ever done television. Very well-known British director who's done Centurion and The Descent, Dog Soldiers, relatively low-budget movies, but with terrific visceral action sequences and a great visual look to them. So we're hoping he'll bring all of that to the screen and give us a very exciting battle. Those of you who watched the first seasons know that we did a lot of things right, but our battles were not our high point. Battles are very hard on a television budget, even an HBO television budget. If you've seen the battles in like Rome, for example, or well, they did very well with the Pacific, but the Pacific had much bigger budgets, and you can do a lot with explosions too, which so I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about some of the new cast members who will be joining. I have seen their auditions, and they're some marvelous actors that we've got. We have Stannis will be joining the thing. Stannis and Melisandre. John meets Ygritte for the first time. We introduce Brienne, Davos Seaworth, Marjorie Tyrell. Lots of great new characters will be joining the mix. So even though I am notorious for killing my characters, I do keep throwing new ones in there too, so you won't miss the dead ones that much. Gotta keep a full larder in case I want to kill some more.
Now, OMG, I am so excited. We're going to turn it over to you folks for a Q&A. I'm going to ask that you raise your hands and wait for the mics to get to you so we can actually properly hear you. So raise your hands. We have a mic over there. Yes.
Hi, George. My name's Gloria. I love your work. Love it, love it, love it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I remember when I first discovered Game of Thrones, I couldn't stop reading it. It was like I'd be so tired and I'd want to throw up because I was so tired, but I couldn't stop reading it. I have, I guess, question. When is your next book coming out?
Well, that's a good question. The next Ice and Fire book will be a few years. I mean, I'm working on it, but these are gigantic books. The last one was 1,500 pages in manuscript. I suspect this next one will also be 1,500 pages. And I've given up predicting how long it's going to take me to write that because every time I do make a prediction, I'm wrong. And then people come howling with torches and pitchforks outside my house. My God, you said it would be by the end of the year, and it's not. And you lied. So I don't want to predict anymore. I just write one page at a time, and it'll be out, I hope, eventually. And even more important, I hope that it'll be good.
It's worth waiting for, folks. Who's got a mic? Yes.
Hi, George. My name's Matt. You mentioned earlier that you wrote mainly to explore and discover new worlds, and Westeros and the world of Song and Ice and Fire is so rich. So I'm wondering, with what's left in the books, how much of Westeros do we have left to discover, and how much do you write because it's necessary for the story, or do you write mainly because, oh, hey, this is a cool place to tell a story in?
No, the story takes over. The story makes its own demands. There are other parts of Westeros that you will see in the last few books. I mean, I haven't brought the action to to Casterly Rock yet. You've never seen Casterly Rock. You've never seen Highgarden. I think both of those locations will play key roles in the books to come. But there is a lot, and you know, I may do when I'm going years ahead now, so who the hell knows what will happen. But the world that I've created there is rich enough to sustain many stories, and the Song of Ice and Fire is only one of those stories. So if I finish these last two books, that will be the end of the story, but not necessarily the end of the world. I think I would probably want to do something else after I finish that, something very different, maybe some short stories, or maybe a science fiction novel or a horror novel I've been thinking of for some time. But eventually, if presuming, of course, I live long enough and keep writing, I might return and tell other stories set in Westeros, in different parts of Westeros, different historical epochs, or different continents and geography. So that might be fun.
Hi, George. How difficult do you think it is for a new science fiction or fantasy writer to break into the industry?
It's actually, if you're good, of course, that's always the proviso. You have to have talent. It's pretty easy to break in, actually. You know, I always advise new writers, young writers, to break in with short stories. That was the way I did it in the 70s, and that's still the best way. I mean, we're fortunate that science fiction fantasy still has half a dozen magazines that are looking for new material every month, and therefore have to read their slush pile in a fairly timely manner to find the contents. You know, the established writers, there's not much money in short fiction. You're not going to get rich writing short fiction by any means, and the result is that most established writers don't do very much short fiction past a certain point in their career. They switch to novels, which is where you can actually make a living. So as a result, there's a lot of openings for new talent in the pages of Analog and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and Asimov's magazine, and even new e-magazines, things like Lightspeed and Tor.com and so forth. And in my mind, a good career path still, as it was in the 70s, is to write a whole bunch of short stories, and sell as many of them as you can, and build a name for yourself in the world of short fiction, because science fiction readers and fantasy readers will notice these stories. And then when you finally do write your first novel, and it hits the stands, it's not just going to be the first novel by some new person that you've never heard of in your life, and why should you pick up their novel when you don't know who they are? It's going to be the long-awaited first novel by this person who's published 20 short stories, and you know, you've been seeing their name in all the magazines, and you kind of like what they did. So it gives you a leg up when you do move to the world of novels, and that's a good way to start.
Up front.
Hey, George. Big fan of yours. I'm on your right side. So I just wanted to ask you, in terms of writing Renly, a lot of people were taken aback in terms of that one scene that had shown up near the end of the season. And I guess they weren't necessarily picking up on a lot of the subtle hints that you had written in the series. So I was wondering if you had wondered in terms of what fan reaction would have been at the earlier stages of the series towards writing a more explicit scene like was seen between Renly and the Native Flowers, and how that might have played out differently if you had written it earlier in the series.
In other words, if I'd had a explicit scene in the books, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what the reaction would have been. You know, I do like to do certain things, I don't know, subtly. I think subtlety is a virtue. There are things in there that some of my readers pick up on and that other readers miss until it's pointed out to them. One of the things, of course, that's changed in recent decades with the advent of the internet is that readers are sharing their reading experiences. So if there's something there and some readers pick up on it and other readers don't, the readers who missed it soon become aware of it by reading the blogs and bulletin boards and the people who are trotting out their theories and showing all the hints and things like that. So that changes things. But I like to reward the readers who are reading closely and paying attention, because there are a lot of things. I like to write the books to reward rereading. I think the first time you read a book, you're reading for plot. You're reading what happens next. Is the guy going to live or die or something like that? But then if you go back and you reread the book, you may pick up things on a second reading or even a third reading that you missed the first time, and you see, oh my God, look what he's doing here. Look at this piece of foreshadowing, or look at this. He said this, and I didn't notice it the first time, but it's right there, etc. Neither Renly nor Loras is a Viewpoint character, and since I'm following a very strict structure of seeing everything through the eyes only of the Viewpoint characters, there was really no way to present explicit details of their relationship without having someone like walk in on them when which is sort of I suppose I could have done, but is a clumsy technique. But a television show is a very different animal, and doesn't have to have the restrictions. The camera is your viewpoint there, and that viewpoint can be pointed anywhere on any character. It doesn't have to necessarily just follow your 6 or 7 designated viewpoint characters. You're going to see a much larger example of that, of course, in the second season episode. One of the things in Clash of Kings is that a lot of stuff is happening to Robb. Robb takes his army west into the Westerlands and is ravishing the Lannister lands. And as those of you who read the books know, various important things happen at the Crag in particular, and we don't learn about any of them. We learn about some of the victories from a distance. Well, Robb has won this battle. Robb has been wounded. Robb is coming back now. He didn't die of his wound. We hear about this all third hand through messages to his mother back at River Run, and finally he shows up, and there's big revelations. But David and Dan in the show are actually going to follow Robb, and we're going to see some of the things that are occurring in the Westerlands. So it's going to be, just as with the Renly Loras thing, it's going to be a lot more explicit, and you're not going to have to rely on third-hand reports or rumors or ravens coming in to tell you what's happening. You will see what's happening with your own 2 eyes.
Over here?
Yeah, this question comes from reading your blog, and I was just very curious as a football fan, just the in the flesh personal experience of the roller coaster ride that the Giants put you on this season.
Oh, God.
And I have to say I'm not too happy, because as a Packers fan, I was not happy about losing that playoff game to JPP and Mr. Cruz. So I'm just curious about what happened and what you were feeling as you watched the losing streak and then them come back and win the Super Bowl.
The winning the Super Bowl part was amazing. I tell you, I love that. There were points where I was really ready to give up on the Giants. I may even have written that on my blog. I mean, that second loss to the Redskins was such a gutless loss. I thought their season was over at that point. It's like they didn't show up in neither of those Redskins games as they showed up to play, but the second one was particularly galling, because they were competing for a playoff berth, and how the hell could they lie down against an awful team like that and lay another egg, especially when a team had beaten them earlier in the season? But, that's my history as a Giants fan. I've noticed, even back in the Parcells days, that the Giants are always one of these teams that seems to play to the level of the opposition. If they are playing a good team like the Packers or the Patriots, they're really tough. They're really good. They play tough against these teams, and even when they lose, like in the game to the Packers in the Giants Stadium, which I actually attended, that was a terrific game. It could have gone either way. Their only mistake was leaving 58 seconds for Aaron Rodgers after they scored the tying touchdown. But then they play the Redskins, who are a terrible team, or the Seahawks they played early in the year, and they play down to the level of opposition. It's like they think, well, they're a better team, they just showed up, they should win. But they never seem to actually crush anyone 42-3 like some of the other good teams do when they're playing a bad team. So it is a roller coaster ride with the Giants and with the Jets, my other team. I often tell Paris, my wife, that she ought to get one of those home defibrillators because I'm sure I'm gonna die during the last 30 seconds of a Jets game as they're in the process of either blowing it or somehow miraculously pulling a win out. So I don't know.
I love that we got a football question in. Over here, next. Yes.
Hello, George. I was wondering if you had any reservations about making your books into a TV series.
If I had any reservations, it's there's always a certain trepidation when you're going to sign the deal. Is this going to turn out well, or are they going to, are they going to ruin it? I liken it to a mother sending her children off to, daycare for the first time. I mean, you had this kid, and he's your kid, and you spent all the time with him, and you've been in charge, and now you're entrusting them to strangers. And are the strangers going to take good care of them? Is he going to get his milk and cookies in time? Or are they actually a bunch of child molesters who are just lurking there, and they're going to get the kid off, and you're going to be gone, and who the hell knows what they're going to do? But, I'd met the people involved. I loved HBO shows. I loved what they did with Rome and Deadwood. So they had a terrific track record. And David and Dan, I had several meetings with. We discussed what they wanted to do, and they said all the right things. I'd read their own work. They were both established writers themselves, and David Benioff in particular had done some amazing work with 25th Hour and Troy and his novels, City of Thieves, and 25th Hour was actually a novel before it was the movie. Kite Runner, so they'd done terrific work. So I didn't think they were child molesters. It seemed pretty good, and you have to take a chance sometime. What is it that Mariel Hemingway says to Woody Allen in Manhattan? There, sometimes you got to trust someone. So I did that too, and also the large dump truck of money that they pull up in front of your house sometimes sways you. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the books continue to exist by themselves. Roger Zelazny, who was a good friend of mine, had the misfortune of having his novel Damnation Alley made into something that purports to be a film. And it was terrible. It was a piece of shit, but they completely ruined the book. But Roger built a whole new wing on his house with the money that they paid him for Damnation Alley. And when he was asked about it, he would always quote James M. Cain, the famous noir writer, who, when asked famously, "Well, Mr. Cain, what do you think about what Hollywood has done to your books?" He would just point to the wall and say, "Hollywood hasn't done anything to my books. They're right over there. They're on the shelves. They're exactly the way I wrote them. Not a word has been changed. So, go forth and enjoy them." And indeed, the original books sell more copies. One thing I've been adamant, though, from the very start of my association with Hollywood and for every project I've ever done in Hollywood, is to retain full and complete publication rights in any deal, and to forbid any novelization. So if any movie is ever made of my work, we will re-release my original novel, and it will sell. We will not have a novelization, even if they completely trashed the novel and changed everything about it, people have to go to the original book, and the original book will benefit from any sales generated by the movie or the television show. We won't have some cheesy novelization written by a hack, which they like to do too, but that's one point where I draw my own personal line. That's always a deal breaker for me if they insist on novelization rights. So yeah, there's always trepidation, but it's worked out well in this case, and that's fine. You have to know who you're doing business with when you are dealing with Hollywood. You know, if Steven Spielberg comes to you, or Guillermo del Toro comes to you when they want to option your work, that's one thing. If Jerry Bruckheimer comes to you, you know, you got a different situation there, and you got to know what you're looking at going in.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have this morning. I want to thank you, Mr. Martin, very much for joining us and for all your amazing work.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. My pleasure.